have a huge, great painting of the trade routes of the Spanish Empire, bringing goods from Spain through to Mexico, shipped by donkey across to the Pacific Ocean, and then taken by galleon fleets all the way to the Philippines, where they would trade the goods from Spain and then ship up with spices and things from the Philippines and bring them all the way back across the Pacific to Mexico, donkey route across to the Atlantic, and then all the way back to Spain. And this went on for like 200 or 300 years and was incredibly wealthy. They were shipping back galleons full of gold from the profits. But the trouble is, of course, that aroused the ire of the Dutch and the British, who thought they wanted some of the action. And so pirates would capture the Spanish galleons. And the people that the British think are the heroes, like Francis Drake, from the Spanish perspective, were just pirates and barbarians, you know. And the Dutch, too, they were regarded as pirates. So that attempt at world governance by the Spanish didn't really work. The Dutch took over because they successfully repelled the Spanish from the Netherlands. They became a great sea power. They absorbed territories in South Africa, in Indonesia, and in other parts of the world, and they had a huge trading empire based around Amsterdam, and their successful sort of, you can call it a burgher civilization, a middle-class civilization. Everybody was kind of equal, and they all had shares in the Dutch East India Company and so on. There wasn't huge class divisions, I don't think, in the Dutch attempt, because it was a democratic semi-republic. But, you know, it eventually broke down after the Japanese conquered the Indonesian holdings of the Dutch, and the British obviously severed the links to South Africa, and the British really replaced the Dutch as the attempt at world governance. So the British Empire took over that project, you know, let's see if we can create a world government. And it kind of almost worked for a while, until it just, you know, again, because it was a military project, it aroused the ire of the people it conquered. The British were not liked in Ireland because they'd conquered Ireland and forbade the people to practice their native Catholic religion. They weren't particularly liked in Scotland, where just because the British Army won the Battle of Culloden, they tried to wipe out the entire Gaelic Highland culture. You weren't allowed to wear a kilt or play the bagpipes or even speak Gaelic, or you could be arrested and done to death. I mean, that kind of cultural imperialism is the problem with this military attempt to create world governance. And that's what we've got to avoid if we're going to be successful. The British Empire failed because the Americans didn't like it, and they rebelled and created the US in opposition to British imperialism. And the Indians didn't like it, and they, with Gandhi to lead them, they rebelled non-violently, which was a very sneaky move and led to success in the end. Gandhi was a great genius who'd been partly educated at the University of London, where I studied. And Gandhi was a great believer also in one day there will be a world governance system, but he thought it should come from our moral growth. It comes as we intellectually become more sophisticated and don't just speak for our own national interest and our own egotistic interest. And that's the view that I take. I was Gandhian coordinator for the Gandhi Foundation for Education for like 6 years in London, from Kingsley Hall, where he used to live in London. More recently, there was, of course, the attempt by the American states to create an empire in its own right. America conquered the Philippines, defeated Japan in World War II, extended to Hawaii at the end of the 19th century. After a brief war against Spain, it extended across the continent and pinched Spanish America's Californian colonies and New Mexico. Those are all Spanish at one point. The US pinched it in the name of, well, they used to call it Manifest Destiny, which was really a sort of, a kind of imperialist, jingoist idea. Let's conquer the other people's territory and pinch it. And the American project also stole a lot of Indian land, never kept the treaties with the native tribes, acted pretty brutally to them. If you read the tragic book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is a history of the American West told from the Indian perspective. I mean, read about the Sand Creek Massacre if you don't believe me. I mean, these American troops, who were like cavalry people, were told to not just to kill the American Indians, who were a small number, and they had machine guns, they just massacred them, but then to cut off their noses, cut off their genitals, absolutely defame the body to prove that they conquered. Disgraceful, unbelievable. Read it in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And Wounded Knee was the end of that trail of triumph of the American, sort of imperialist project, which the American Indians, I think, can look at with, obviously, a different perspective than was promoted by American nationalism. And again, but like all cultures, it had good and bad. The people that did the Sand Creek Massacre were not all Americans. There were Thoreaus, there were Emersons, there were, good leaders like Roosevelt or Kennedy. And, America's contributed a lot to world civilization. I don't think it wants an American, world governance. I think what America stands for at its best, and we shouldn't forget that America had a lot of Dutch input. After all, New York was called New Amsterdam for 100 years, and a lot of what we call America was actually Dutch, as well as the English contribution, and of course the ever-present American Indian native contribution, led by people like Dekanawida, who was the founder of American federalism, if you want. I think that the good aspects of America can contribute to a global governance system. And that's symbolised by the UN in New York. I've spoken twice at the UN headquarters. There are good people working there. And they are trying to build a global governance system. Another attempt was, of course, world communism and the Soviet Empire, which was a pretty fearsome thing in its day, and developed nuclear weapons. And when I was growing up as a kid, the Cold War was the thing we were all afraid of, nuclear weapons landing on London and the end of the world. And I always tried to be kind of neutral between the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc, because I could see some aspects of goodness in both sides, And not being an extremist, I don't like extreme capitalism where everybody, just the rich are happy and the poor just go to the wall. But I also didn't like Stalinist top-down, party controls everything type communism. And when I read my philosophy and history degree at the University of London, and I did research all this in detail, it confirmed my fears that the Soviet Empire wasn't a universal good. A lot of people on the extreme left in British politics were saying, no, the Soviet Union is the place to be, we should all go and visit and join the Communist Party and support their project, But when you actually read the details of what the Russians and the Soviets did to their own people, when I read Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, for the first time in my 20s, when I did my history degree, you learned about the Great Terror which Stalin inflicted, killing hundreds of thousands, actually millions of Russians in the name of communism. So this thing that was supposed to be a good thing was then imposed violently on its own people. And I've just been researching, this was done particularly against Ukraine. And that's why it's so ironic that it's bubbled up again, this war, because it's sort of unfinished historical business. What happened with the Soviet Bolshevik seizure of power, which was non-democratic, the Bolsheviks took the view that we don't have to be democratic because we have the way, the truth and the light. So our little coterie of a few thousand people led by Lenin and Stalin and co we can impose our will against millions of other people because we know the truth. Now that's arrogant, and it's unfounded, and Aristotle would say, you've got to be joking. It's like it's like the worst aspects of meritocracy, because these people are not actually that intelligent. Stalin was actually an ill-educated brute. He was just sneaky. And then in himself had very little knowledge of philosophy. He was clever in his own little narrow one-track way. He was very good at stealing power and manipulating things. But he wasn't a broad thinker. He wasn't an actual philosopher, Lenin. And so what that little coterie did is they kind of weaponized ignorance, actually, because by being closed-minded and saying only Marx is true, nothing else is, they're throwing out 166 boxes from the periodic table and consigning them on the ash heap of history, and they're saying only the box of Marxism, which is one of the humanist boxes, is true. Now that's just fanatical intellectual terrorism. But that's what they did. It's shocking. And what they did in Ukraine, I've been reading about, listening to Timothy Snyder's excellent book called The Killing Field, The Killing Lands. He's talking about Ukraine. It's seen more deaths on its territory in the 20th century. I think 15 million people died in Ukraine during the 20th century, more than anywhere else on earth. And it all started with the Holodomor, which was a deliberately engineered famine by the Soviet administration led by Stalin, who wanted to punish the Ukrainians for being successful farmers. I mean, get this. So they insisted that all the Ukrainians should surrender their farms to state farms. They called it collectivization. They collectivized the farms. So here in France, there's lots of little farms doing quite well, thank you very much. Now, if somebody said, no, every 20 farms have to become one thing, run by the government, it became problematic because the guy from the government doesn't actually know how to run farms. He's just a bureaucrat sent from the Bolshevik party. And this collectivization became an instrument of state terror, because what happened was they were taking all the food from Ukraine and then selling it to make money for the Soviet state or to feed other parts of Russia. So they systematically ransacked the Ukraine of its grain and its cattle and its foodstuffs. And this was all masterminded on the orders of Lenin by a really unpleasant guy called Lazar Kaganovich, who lived from 1893 to 1891. He's a kind of anti-philosopher. These guys that claim to be intellectuals, but actually they're killers. He also signed tens of thousands of death warrants during the Great Terror. And he personally was in charge of sealing the Ukraine. After all the food had been stolen from the Ukraine, it was shipped out of the state, and people were starving to death. There was nothing to eat. And they sent in teams of Bolshevik, like shock troops, to take every last bit of grain. And if you had a cow, it was taken. So these poor peasants were literally dying in their tens of thousands, and actually millions. Somewhere around 3.3 to 3.9 million Ukrainians perished during the 2 years from 1932 to 33. Now, it wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. This was done on the orders of Stalin by his henchmen, particularly Kaganovich. And this is genocide. It's never been acknowledged. You couldn't even say this in Russia. If I was a Russian philosopher teaching this in the 80s, I couldn't. It was only after Gorbachev relaxed with his concepts of perestroika that you could begin to talk about the truth. And then, fortunately, historians have documented all this. This is now factual, it's accepted. But there's never been an official apology. And what's the worst possible outcome is that now Putin's come into power. He's reversed all that. He's now said, you can't talk about this anymore. You're not allowed to criticize Stalin. The Holodomor never happened. The Ukrainians are to blame. No, the Russians are the good people, and that's why they're trying to conquer Ukraine. So it's like history's made a 50-year leap back down the wrong rabbit hole. under Putin, who presumably, I mean, I have a philosophical question about these psychopaths like Kaganovich, who seem to take delight in killing tens of thousands of people. You know, how do they possibly justify it? What do they think about? You know, what's going on in their heads? How can they sleep at night? And how can Putin? You know, does he not realise the error, morally speaking, of what he's doing? I'll just leave that question hanging there. We'll maybe go on to look at that in part 2. Okay, so that's the situation we're facing now. It's out of all this chaos, the competing interests of these great powers and so on. How can we build any kind of world governance system that's going to endure? That's what we'll look at in part 2. And we'll have some questions and stuff first.